Hello people, today I wanted to talk about something quite a bit more serious. It's it's illness and the way society and the medical profession perceive it. When I say illness, I don't mean absolutely all illness, I mean medically unexplained illness, and in that category I'm including autoimmune disease, in which the mechanism of disease is understood. For instance, in MS, the immune system attacks the body, the myelin sheath of nerves, but not the cause. So many illnesses, in fact you could even say most illnesses, fall under this heading. The medical profession understands what is happening in the body most of the time, but they don't understand why it's happening, and the why is the important thing. I'll briefly, very briefly touch on my own past, my experience with this type of illness and what I've learned from it. As a kid, I was very anxious, and on family holidays I would get an intense pain in my stomach. In fact, it wasn't really a pain, it was more of an awful churning, nauseous type of feeling, and it was completely incapacitating, and I would have to just lie writhing on the bed for hours until it passed. I didn't know why it only happened on holidays. I also used to lick my lips obsessively when I was anxious. Again, I didn't realise I was anxious at the time, but looking back I can see it only happened when, for instance, we were on family holidays. When, for some reason, I was very anxious, I won't go into why, but lick my lips to the point where there was a red line around my mouth that was chapped, cracked and bleeding. A few years later, when we moved house and my dad began to work on the house, our house, and wasn't in work, the painful stomach aches came back, and I had a lot more of them, and I realised I was anxious because the difficult circumstances my family were in and the fact that my dad was present most of the time were the cause of the bad stomachs, looking back. I also had a few pets at the time, cats and dogs, and I used to worry a lot about them if they went missing or if they were ill. And I also spent some time separated from my parents at this time, and while I was separated from them, the bad stomachs were very prominent. Now, at the time I had no idea why, and neither did my mum. She thought it could be a change in water or some food I was allergic to, but I can see looking back it was clearly emotionally induced. That was my childhood experience of emotionally induced bodily disease. Not disease, but discomfort, intense discomfort. And then I became a workaholic through my teenage years and didn't have any more illness. In fact, I was incredibly strong physically throughout my GCSE, A-levels and time at Oxford. I often used to work 18-hour days. Sometimes I didn't go to bed at all. I was so strong, I survived on a diet of pretty much just junk food during my university years. And despite great strain, because being in the religion I was in and going to university itself were two diametrically opposed mind frames, and the strain was intolerable, and the workload I put myself under was intolerable, and the religion required quite a lot of work as well. But despite that, my body was fine. I functioned, I would say, perfectly until my third year at Oxford, when I began to be fatigued and I began to think I could hear a noise in my room which no one else could hear. And I see looking back that was a symptom of anxiety. However, I would have laughed at the notion of chronic fatigue syndrome and ME the illness I would go on to develop at that time, I would have thought if a doctor couldn't find anything wrong with you, then there was nothing wrong with you and you were just being pathetic and you should pull yourself together, and that the people who succumbed to such an illness, such a nebulous illness that no one understood, were simply not pushing themselves hard enough. After finals, I went to work in Madrid with 2 friends, and exhaustion began to hit quite hard there, and also the inability to sleep. When I returned to the UK, after not very long in Madrid, because I sensed I just simply could not physically keep going, I sensed something was going to happen, and I came home and heard a noise one night, a couple of weeks after I returned to the UK, in my head, which was tinnitus, and I still have it now. It doesn't bother me at all, in fact I'm not conscious of it, but at the time it triggered a nervous breakdown. Now, the received medical opinion about tinnitus is that they don't know the cause unless it's induced by noise damage, which mine wasn't. In fact, I'd kind of shielded myself from noise for many years because I used to wear earplugs day and night often, especially towards the end of my Oxford years, because I didn't want to be disturbed by anything. So it certainly wasn't damaged through noise, through loud noise. And so the doctors just said, we don't know why this has happened and it will probably never go away and we can't do anything for you. Then I while still dealing with the breakdown, went to do an MA. And during the MA, because I was in such a bad mental state, I manifested severe urticaria, acute, itchy little red hives all over my body. And that was another kind of torture. So there was the noise in my head, and then my body covered with an insatiable itching, these hives. We tried homeopathic remedies for the tinnitus and the urticaria, and none of them did any good at all. We tried natural remedies such as aloe vera for the urticaria. It didn't do any good at all. The received medical opinion about the urticaria was that there was no cause, and the doctors didn't know if it would stay for good. So exactly the same verdict as with the tinnitus. When I finished the MA, the exhaustion was severe, but I pushed myself to run one day, run very, very hard when I came home. And while running down this country lane, my body began to break down. I felt sicker and sicker, and a sense of dread, which was physical. It wasn't like an emotional sense of dread. I felt desperately ill. I managed to walk home, and then I lay on the floor in the sitting room and I couldn't move. Later that day I managed to go to bed, and I knew that something terribly wrong was happening inside my body. It felt like going down with the flu, and I should say that a couple of months prior to that I'd had glandular fever, which hit me very, very hard. I was exhausted from it, mad for sleep, like a mania to sleep. And then when I woke up the next morning after this run, I felt exactly the same. I can't actually quite remember now how ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, as it would be diagnosed within a couple of weeks, how it felt. I can remember the symptoms. I remember that my movements were jerky, not visually, but they felt jerky, like a felt tip pen had run out and was kind of squeaking and shuddering across the paper. I remember that my muscles felt like they'd been worked into the ground, worked to death, like I'd just climbed Everest or rode across the channel or run a marathon. I remember even turning over in bed was nearly impossible. Lifting my arm was impossible. My mum had to help me wash. She had to feed me for a while. I remember being drenched in sweat and shaking. I remember not being able to sleep. That was one of the worst things, because of course I wanted to sleep more than anything, because the disorder is characterised mainly by fatigue, but fatigue is an inadequate term. I felt more like I had the flu or some very severe viral illness like glandular fever. And I also felt like I'd stepped off a cliff, that feeling of terror when and the sickness that you feel when you're falling, that was on and off present with me. So fatigue just doesn't do it. And believe me, I was the sort of person that would have pushed through it if I could, but I couldn't. And I wanted to push through it more than anything because, again, the received medical opinion was that they didn't know why this had happened. This was here for good. And this was probably my life from now on. So here I was, 24 years old. I had a heck of a lot I wanted to do, as any 24-year-old does. And it had been completely written off, just a full stop. So my days consisted of bed rest. And my nights consisted of tossing and turning and not being able to sleep. And dealing with the tinnitus, which was still there. So this went on for about 2 years, and we tried homeopathy, we tried changing my diet drastically, we tried high doses of fish oil, which is the type we tried was called EPA. I tried meditation, crystals, various drops and remedies. I tried nebulization of magnesium, so I'd wear a mask and inhale magnesium. I tried trampolining. Well, the only way I could trampoline was sit on the edge of a trampoline, a mini trampoline we bought, and bounce like that. If you can sense anger in my voice, it's because all of it was unnecessary. And I'm not just angry for myself, I'm angry for other people that are going through this, that will go through this, and that won't come out of it like I do. But I'll get to the crux at the end. My mum is a hero or a heroine. She did an immense amount of medical research at this time. And sorry, but I'm skipping ahead. I also tried graded exercise, which is the received medical treatment for ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. And it made me worse. I also tried cognitive behavioural therapy, and that made me worse as well. My mum did an immense amount of research at this time, and she came across something called body-mind therapy, which is an umbrella term that covers a lot of different kind of avant-garde therapies, as they are at the moment, that take a different approach to illness or bodily dis-ease. And they say that many illnesses, or medically unexplained illnesses, are caused by suppressed emotion, by someone leading a greatly emotionally impoverished life, and by prolonged stress. Now, although my mum had found out about this, I was so afraid that the body-mind therapy we chose to go with, that apparently had a 98% success rate in treating ME, they don't use the word cure because the patient has to work to remain well. or not work, but keep putting into practice the therapy to remain well. So it's not a cure as such, it's a new way of living. But despite this phenomenal success rate of reverse therapy, which was the body-mind therapy we decided to try, I didn't read about it until the day before we travelled to see the therapist, who lived in Newbury, and by this time we were living in the New Forest. Because I was so afraid that the therapy wouldn't make sense to me, and I knew that if it didn't ring true and make sense to me, it wouldn't work. However, the opposite was the case. I read the booklet. At that time there wasn't a book, I don't think, or maybe there was. In any case, my uncle printed off an e-book for me, and I read it actually on the way to the therapy in the back of my uncle's car. And inside, my heart or my soul, whatever the kind of intuitive part of us is, just began crying with relief and delight and hope, because it made so much sense. The therapy was describing a person like me, a person who didn't know how to live, a person who didn't know how to look after themselves, how to emotionally nourish themselves, how to balance their life, and who had driven themselves into the ground, into the earth. However, I was still afraid that I wouldn't be able to put into practice what it told me to do. And I'll be honest with you, it was not easy. It was like going through a wall of fire. That is partly because the circumstances of my life at the time made implementing the therapy very, very difficult. My mum and I lived a very isolated existence. We were very poor, and in order to recover from ME and chronic fatigue syndrome, which are synonymous, and many other autoimmune diseases and body-mind disorders such as irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, urticaria, tinnitus, sciatica, psoriasis, eczema, migraine. The list continues. Reverse therapy posits that the patient must begin to do things they enjoy. So that's the therapy boiled down into a nutshell. And also the patient must address emotional suppression, or those areas in their life where their emotions are being sat upon instead of expressed, and their needs are not being met. So all of that was quite difficult because I just simply couldn't access instantly what I needed, which was friends, recreational activities, a support network, fun, absorbing yet nourishing activities. So it took me about 6 months of kind of hell, of doing stuff that was pretty agonizing at times, because at the same time as doing it, I knew it wasn't helping, and so I was afraid I would never get better, and that anxiety was the biggest hurdle in getting better. I think even if I had such desultory and kind of inadequate activities to do, but had known all along I would eventually get better, then it would have been 70% easier, but I didn't. In any case, I did get pretty much better. That the summer after I began the therapy, unbelievably, even though I believed in the theory of the therapy, I still wasn't sure it would work for me at the beginning, but it did. Unbelievably, I was myself again. I could run, I could play tennis, I could play the guitar, I could dance, I could sing, I could sleep through the night. My appetite was normal. All the symptoms had receded into the background. Even the tinnitus wasn't bothering me anymore. And it was as if my life had been given back to me, and it had. at 27 or 26, I can't remember, in that summer, my life was given back to me, and I now had the tools to live it in a new way. However, I didn't. Because I am a workaholic, and like any addiction, it's kind of wound up in your DNA and is so bound up with you. That summer, instead of following the principles of the body-mind therapy, I chose to begin a work project that was intense and that would take another 6 months, and that would become manic and obsessive, and that project was making the hundreds of little people I've talked about in another video. Now, this wasn't entirely my fault. You might think it was incredibly ungrateful, irresponsible, and downright stupid of me to do something I knew wasn't healthy, but I still didn't know how to make the next leap into real life. I knew that if I went into a job, very likely the ME or chronic fatigue syndrome would come back unless it was a nourishing and pleasant environment. I didn't know how to make the leap between the kind of half-life I'd been living and this kind of closeted world in which I was still tentatively better and leaping into full-time work and life again. I had no transport, I had no money, I was out in the countryside. I didn't know even what the heck to do with my future. I had been on a path to academia, but now I knew that I couldn't go back to that because that was partly what had made me ill in the first place. I knew I didn't want to teach. I'd already done some teaching in Madrid and I hated it. I wasn't a teacher. I knew I loved music, but what the heck was I going to do with that? And how was I to make money? And in any case, so you see, it wasn't as easy as just taking the next step. There was a kind of leap, a bit like in Indiana Jones, I can't remember what film, where they don't see how to cross the chasm and they take the step and an invisible path appears beneath them. Well, I didn't take the step, partly because of circumstances and also partly because of my addiction, my work addiction. And so I went back into myself, back into intense work, which in fact helped to a certain extent because it was so absorbing. And for many of those months, my health remained stable and I was remarkably strong physically again. I worked through the night. I produced an immense amount of tiny models. But at the end of that 6 months of intense activity, I had developed another illness, this time called by the medical profession RSI, or repetitive strain injury. One morning I woke up with a pain in each elbow and a pain in each wrist here, and my GP said, "Oh, it's RSI, you've got it for good, probably, you just have to manage it, we don't know what to do for you. It's caused by repetitive activity," which made sense at the time because I had used my hands and arms intensely for 6 months. I went to a physiotherapist and she said exactly the same thing. So again, my life completely closed down. And the physiotherapist told me to wear slings, and not to do anything that hurt. Well, even brushing my teeth hurt, even lifting a cup hurt. So, desperate once again to get well, I did what they told me. My both arms were in slings. We bought a special chair because somebody said, "Oh, your posture is awful, this is the reason." So we bought this office chair that cost £600. I did these various exercises with this kind of stretchy elastic fabric every day to so-called strengthen my arms. I went to acupuncture for another, I don't know, year, We wasted so much money on homeopathy again. I dunk my elbows in this foul smelling mixture of bark and looked like shit from the acupuncturist for a year. Nothing. Then again, my heroic mum heard about this therapy called TFT, or thought field therapy, which sounded a bit like a load of baloney, but it seemed to work. And for those of you who don't know, a therapist performs a series of tapping motions on the patient's body, and this is supposed to interrupt streams of thought. And to be honest, it was my thoughts that were crucifying me still. Even though the pain in my arms was sometimes like toothache, it was pretty miserable. But still, the bottom line was the thought that I can't live with this for the rest of my life, stopping me doing the things I want to do. So I went to this TFT therapist in London. Just have a drink. So I went to this TFT therapist in London, and he performed all these mystical tapping motions on my body. And I read the literature, and to be honest, I kind of bought into it, because I didn't really understand it. And I didn't understand how these tapping certain points on the body changed thought patterns, but apparently they did, and there were a lot of testimonials. So I came away with some hope, but what's more, I came away with a recommendation for a book that the TFT therapist told me about. The book was called The Body Mind Prescription by Dr. John Sarno. So I ordered it on Amazon and it came through the post. I'll never know if TFT would have worked for RSI, because within a couple of weeks I'd read this book. And I just want to say, I don't think the TFT would have worked. I remember being in absolute misery, doing this series of tapping motions in the bedroom in the thatched cottage in the New Forest one day, soon after I'd had the therapy. And I remember feeling no different afterwards. And the goal of the thought field therapy wasn't to get rid of the pain, it was to change the way you felt about the pain. But I felt the same. So I personally I think that is a load of baloney. Anyway, I read this book. Within a week to 10 days, the pain that had been in both elbows and both wrists for 2 years disappeared. This book essentially says what reverse therapy had said, which is that if someone is not expressing emotion, if they're leading a life that makes them angry, that makes them sad, and that makes them frightened, their body will manifest what their emotions are not allowed to manifest, or they're not allowing their emotions to manifest. And the body has a whole range of diseases and discomforts in its arsenal. What John Sarno, who is now sadly died, says is that the subconscious mind, or is it the unconscious? I can't remember. I think it's this. He says the subconscious mind creates a diversion. These diversions can be excruciating. He mentions patients of his that have had surgery for back pain, and surgeons have found the supposed cause of their back pain, for instance, a herniated disc. And they've lived lives in agony and misery, and the surgery's done nothing. And within a very short period of time of learning of his therapy, if it can be called therapy, because it's simply knowledge, there isn't even a therapy to go along with this, his school of thought. All that is needed is the subconscious mind, the sabotage technique of the subconscious mind to be exploded by the conscious mind realizing what's happened. It's like a sleight of hand happening in our own brain. I read it, it made absolute sense. the pain went away. So yet again, I was sort of free, sort of well. But in the time it took, in that 2 years, while I was incapacitated with my arms in slings, I'd begun writing one novel and then split it into 3 novels by means of speech recognition software. So I would wear a little microphone and speak into a computer. This was hell. This was hell. I have heard that speech recognition software has improved a lot since 2007, 2008 when I was using it. At the time, it was awful. You had to train it like you would a dog. It got every other word wrong and I couldn't use my arms to correct anything. It was a recipe for frustration. I don't know how to describe the levels of frustration. Anyway, basically I felt I had to finish these novels. So instead of putting reverse therapy into practice and trying to steer my life towards pleasurable activities, I continued to work myself into the ground to finish the novels in a race against time, because I knew writing them was making me very unhappy. It was all-consuming. I only seemed to be able to work in an all-consuming way. So I knew I had to finish them quickly in order not to get ill again. But you can't really rush a novel. And to be fair, I was trying to move my life in a good direction, but circumstances were just so bloody difficult still. I was still living in a thatched cottage in the middle of nowhere with my mum, with no form of transport, nobody I knew around me. And a few months after the pain in my arms went, I think, at least if I remember rightly, I began to wake with dread at night, with a feeling that was worse than any illness I'd experienced. A feeling of, I don't know how to describe it, horror. It was a sickening, burning sensation in the centre of my chest. It felt like my heart was being burnt. It felt like I was falling. It felt like grief and terror rolled into one, and I would wake with this kind of incinerating sensation in my chest and not know what to do with myself. This was because I was so unhappy and I felt trapped into finishing writing 3 novels, which I knew I had to write. I couldn't let them just sit inside me, and at the same time I didn't know how to make my life better while I was writing them. Not very long after I experienced this feeling in my chest at night, I began to wake feeling dizzy, so dizzy that I would stagger to the toilet and sit on the toilet seat swaying backwards and forwards. Not long after that, my movements began to become jerky again, and I began to be very fatigued, not in the same way I was fatigued with the ME, which was an unnatural fatigue and wouldn't let me sleep, but this time the fatigue, I had trouble staying awake. There were a few other symptoms as well, and at the time I found a tick bite. Actually, I found a tick in my leg, because bear in mind we lived in the New Forest, and putting the tick bite and the symptoms together, a specialist, the GP didn't know what was wrong with me, but a specialist thought I had Lyme disease, so I was treated with a massive dose of antibiotics in order to eradicate the Lyme disease. The symptoms continued, and the specialist thought, oh, okay, the antibiotics didn't work, and you have Lyme disease for life. So this was all well and good, but trying to research myself as to what could be wrong with me, I entered my collection of symptoms one night in a kind of search engine and did a questionnaire, and the most obvious cause was something called MS, or multiple sclerosis. And then researching MS, I discovered that it quite often follows on from ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. And that night I plunged into horror, and for the next 8 or 9 years, during which the symptoms continued and during which I moved to London and attended a music college for a year, I was in terror that I would be diagnosed with MS imminently. I had multiple scans of my brain, a lumbar puncture. Nothing was discovered. But the nightmare continued unabated because the body-mind therapies I'd already found out about had at that time not... Right, sorry about that little interruption. With MS, my symptoms look more and more like MS as I passed through my late 20s and into my early 30s. All the time I lived in London, and most of the time I was still writing the novels. With MS there is no help unless you get a diagnosis. Then people have started on a regime of quite damaging drugs, steroidal drugs I think, and drugs which try to control the immune system. Because I couldn't get a diagnosis, I couldn't get any help from doctors. And I lived in this state of sometimes very debilitating symptoms and this limbo of, this purgatory of terror for about 10 years. I remember sometimes I couldn't speak, my speech would be slurred. I lost the use completely of my arm for about 24 hours. At other times I experienced foot drop, so I couldn't lift my feet properly off the floor. My walking became jerky. At its worst, I felt my whole body was liquefying, kind of disintegrating. It was terrifying. I had to give up a part-time job I had in a bookshop. And needless to say, at this time as well, I was very unhappy. My life was deeply emotionally unfulfilling. I lived in a permanent state of either anger or rage, actually, fear, or deep, deep grief. Then I discovered in one of my endless internet searches something called low-dose naltrexone, which was actually halting the progress of MS and all other autoimmune diseases, and things like fibromyalgia and eczema and psoriasis and kind of more minor, not life-threatening illnesses. This is it. Low-dose naltrexone is actually a sublingual form of it, so I take 9 drops every night, 4.5 milligrams under my tongue, or just orally. Mostly people take it in a kind of syringe form, in a kind of syrupy liquid. Because I hated the taste of the syrupy liquid, I took the drops instead, which don't taste very nice, but anyway. Low-dose naltrexone is beginning to be known in the medical community, but is still not prescribed by GPs. So I get this via private prescription from the only doctor who prescribes it in the UK, which is Dixon's Pharmacy in Glasgow, and they post it to me. When I discovered this drug, because it is a drug, naltrexone was used to help alcoholics and wean them off alcohol, but in a low dose form it actually alters the way the body's immune system works, because it supplies the body with an overload of endorphins, and endorphins directly affect the immune system. When I heard this, I began to connect lots and lots of pieces in my head, because reverse therapy and body-mind therapies and the principles of John Sarno's thought all stress the importance of happiness in emotional regulation, but also immune system regulation. So discovering low-dose naltrexone and understanding the mechanism of how it worked fitted in perfectly with what I'd already learnt by means of body-mind therapies. And sure enough, after about 10 years of suffering symptoms of what looked very much like MS, sometimes it looked like Parkinson's, or other frightening neurodegenerative diseases, within, I'd say, about 3 months of taking a nightly dose of LDN or low-dose naltrexone, the symptoms went into abeyance and I was pretty much symptom-free. A couple of years later, when I stopped taking LDN because I'd felt normal for so long, I thought I didn't need to take it anymore. About 6 or 9 months after I stopped, I had a flare-up of symptoms and was unable to walk, and that was when I had to finish work in the bookshop. And again, I entered a phase of utter terror. This time, my mum and I researched. My mum, I don't know, she should be some sort of researcher for some. She's got such a gift for research. She discovered vitamin D therapy for MS, which I still hadn't been diagnosed with. But vitamin D is apparently a hormone, not really a vitamin, and it has a very powerful effect on the body's immune system. And it regulates it. And vitamin D is also linked to depression and unhappiness if a person lacks sufficient levels of it. So I began vitamin D therapy with a private practitioner because, of course, again, vitamin D is not prescribed for MS, although the medical community is beginning to see the benefits of it. Now, I wasn't taking vitamin D long enough to know whether it would have helped me, because I'm trying to remember what happened. I think I again began to feel well. And because the private therapist I was working with, who was prescribing vitamin D, I found quite trying to work with, and just the phone discussions, the phone consultations we would have would kind of stress me and exhaust me. I decided to stop the vitamin D therapy and just continue with the LDN, which I have since then. Now, every now and then, even though I take LDN, I do experience episodes of dizziness and what I call derealization, where I feel my head is not kind of attached to my body. It's very, very unpleasant. It feels sort of, you feel numb, you feel out of yourself, but not in a nice kind of meditative way. And that happens when I've been doing unfulfilling things for a prolonged period of time, for months, and there's kind of an emotional backlog in my system of stress or anger or sadness, and I know that I have to kind of put my life back on track. Now, since I discovered LDN and vitamin D therapy for MS, I've also realised that reverse therapy, the therapy I turn to help me recover completely from ME and chronic fatigue syndrome, and Mickle therapy, which is almost the same as reverse therapy. In fact, they both stemmed from the same discoveries, and the two proponents of both therapies, the proponents of each therapy initially worked together before they had a divergence of thought. both reverse therapy and mycotherapy, which are body-mind therapies, have now extended their repertoire and are offering therapy to sufferers of MS and Parkinson's disease and lupus, and are having success with previously incurable, life-threatening, very, very serious illnesses indeed, which is the best news in the world. And it validates and vindicates what Dr. John Sarno said in a chapter late in his book. In fact, I think it's an appendix, in which he postulates that autoimmune disorders may have a body-mind proponent, i.e. autoimmune disease processes in the body may be triggered by emotional upset and stress. Now, this has been well known for quite a long time, especially with something like MS. Often a traumatic event initiates the first flare-up of symptoms, and relapses every now and then are occasioned by the same by trauma or stress that the person is just not coping with. So due to knowledge, due to a therapy that I learned to put into practice, and that's hard work to put into practice, but that I return to every now and then, due to a backup, like a safety net of something called low-dose naltrexone, I keep whatever is wrong with me in abeyance. And sometimes, despite all I know and despite what I can take, I'm still not well at all. But what about those people who know nothing of body-mind therapies? What about those people who know nothing of the way endorphins, pleasure, happiness, sadness, stress, fear and anxiety all influence the immune system? Now, why I'm angry is because even societies like the MS Society and the ME organisation don't readily accept and propound these therapies that help everyone who simply is able to put into practice what they teach, or everyone who simply takes these drops. I don't understand why organisations supposedly there to help people don't embrace these ways of thinking, these therapies and these medications. Because finally there is a cure for life-threatening illnesses, even perhaps cancer, especially early cases of cancer. And yet the organisations supposedly there to help people don't embrace them. Much worse is the medical community, who are blinkered and won't look outside their own textbooks, which are pretty much hundreds of years out of date. Now we know that illness in the body, and I'm not talking about things like appendicitis or pneumonia or tuberculosis, which are caused by things outside us, but illnesses caused by the body itself attacking its own organism, is solely caused by emotional dysregulation and prolonged and unrelieved stress. Now, it's in the interests of the very powerful drug companies which manufacture and market phenomenally expensive drugs, which in themselves damage people, not to let people know about these, what is still termed alternative or new age. No, it's not new age. It's in the interests of these very powerful drug companies not to have people know about these other things, these life-saving things. And actually, a lot of people who are desperately ill, for whatever reason, maybe they've tried so many different therapies or so many different treatments and just can't face thinking about anything else, or because they're so frightened that they choose to stay with received medical wisdom and information. They themselves don't want to know about this. I've had family members or close friends very ill with illnesses I know could be resolved through these therapies, and sometimes I've tentatively suggested these things to them, and sometimes I've just known better and just stayed quiet because I knew they wouldn't be receptive to them. However, maybe someone watching this video, some of what I've said will have the ring of truth to you. You will see the sense of it. It will go home. The information will go home in the same way it went home with me. And maybe someone, somewhere, will get better because of it. I've learned in my life that most received human wisdom is wrong. It's erroneous. What most people are believing and following is misguided. So I guess I'm lucky because I've learned through experience, which is the only way to learn anything, what's true for me. And I can't actually say more than that. I've experienced the truth of certain things in my own life. I believe they will help other people. There are countless testimonials to support the fact that they help most people, nearly everyone, unless someone is closed-minded or has something else seriously wrong with them medically that they're not aware of and that is hampering their recovery. I've learned truths that have been shrouded from most people and that are probably poo-pooed and laughed at by still the majority of people. And the only comfort I have is that eventually the truth will come out. Truth always comes out. And so it's just a waiting game. It's just a question of time. In 100 years, people will know irrefutably the impact that emotions have on our physical well-being. Emotions are chemicals. They directly influence our immune system, our blood pressure, our digestion, our brain function, our circulation. They exist all over the body. They're not just located in the brain. Anyway, eventually the truth will out. The light will shine forth. In the meantime, countless other people will live lives of misery, perhaps commit suicide because of illnesses that are avoidable. I read just the other day of someone in the newspaper. A woman helped her daughter to kill herself because she had ME and had had it for so many years and was living in an unbearable way. And people will die of things like MS or Parkinson's or lupus. And obviously that can't be avoided because it takes an awful long time for the light to shine through into this morass of humanity. But shine through it will. And I just have to thank whatever is out there, or whatever powers that be, and I don't know what powers that be anymore, for showing me through a pretty harrowing process, nevertheless, the way out. Thanks for watching. I just have a couple more things to say on the subject of illness, which I forgot to say before. Probably it occurs to some of you who've listened to what I said earlier in the video that the symptoms may never have been MS or something serious, but simply psychosomatic or anxiety induced. And of course that occurred to me the whole time as well. The problem was that when I did discover the LDN, they did seem to coincide with me going on and off it. But then again, LDN, because it rebalances the endorphins in the body, could indeed and does treat depression and anxiety as well. So it would have helped even if the symptoms were psychologically induced. And reverse therapy, Mikkel therapy and other body-mind therapies also help anxiety and depression and can eradicate them, because after all they're to do with addressing troubling emotions, expressing them and leading a more fulfilling life. The other thing I wanted to say is that not only did doctors throughout my life prove to be no help at all, they were positively damaging, because in every instance they told me to do the direct opposite of the thing that would have made me better. So for instance, with ME, when I had ME or chronic fatigue syndrome as it's also sometimes known, doctors recommended absolute rest. Well, in fact, absolute rest is the thing the body doesn't want you to do. The body wants you to start leading a more fulfilling life, which couldn't be more opposed to lying in bed all day. And the same with RSI. The doctors told me to not do anything that hurt my arms, which just kept the whole cycle of anxiety and subconscious manifestation of symptoms going. The third thing I wanted to say is that what has become apparent to me throughout this whole journey is that emotion and illness, or suppression of emotion and illness are two sides of the same coin. So I did notice that sometimes when my symptoms receded, because I began a treatment or a therapy, my emotions suddenly came to the fore. So very difficult to deal with emotions like rage, grief, anxiety. They would come to the fore when the symptoms receded. Again and again and again I saw this happening. And I would also like to say that I do believe addiction and affliction are two sides of the same coin as well, because I can see a clear pattern in my life between alternating phases of manic work. Work is my addiction, and then periods of illness. And in a way, the addiction helped me manage my unbearable emotions. The emotions were kind of smothered by the work, but then they came a crisis point, and affliction or illness manifested instead of addiction. And so managing illness for me personally is coterminous with managing my addiction to work. The last thing I wanted to mention is the last but one thing I wanted to mention is that I really experienced the truth of all of this so clearly when I was at my illest. When I was at my illest with what I thought was MS, and may well have been MS, I couldn't walk properly and I had difficulty speaking. And during that time, I was supposed to go to the Bronte Parsonage in Haworth in Yorkshire to give a talk with Tracy Chevalier and Jessie Burton on miniaturization in the work of the Brontes. And I didn't know right up until the last minute whether I should go, and possibly it will be a disaster and I not be able to speak or talk properly. I did go in kind of the depths of despair and just thinking, I'm just going to go through the motions, that's all I can do. And over the course of about 48 hours in Yorkshire with Jessie and Tracy, and actually mainly after the event at which we spoke, and which was highly stressful. I can remember sweat I could feel the sweat trickling down my back. My heart was racing. I couldn't breathe properly. And even afterwards, speaking to people in the room, although that was lovely because there were lots of inspiring people there, and we were all interested in similar things, and we had a lot to talk about. Lots of creative people there. It was still stressful, but it was a good kind of stress. And after that event, that evening when we went back to the guest house where we were staying, which was the most lovely old building, I'll put the link below, and we had the most lovely supper with the owners of the farmhouse, and Jessie and Tracy and I were bonding well and had a lovely evening. My difficulty walking and talking had completely disappeared, so that was actually just 24 hours, and then the next day there was no trace of the illness at all, until the train brought me back into London and I returned to my familiar surroundings and my life setup. And at that time, that was nigh on a miracle to me, because for months I had not been able to walk or move properly. And within 24 hours of a completely different environment, different stimuli, different people, different energy, I was a different person. And that brings me to my last point, which is that what I've also noticed during my journey is that I'm extremely sensitive to people and places and environments. I can go into a coffee shop and sit down beside someone, not even know if they're a man or a woman, not know anything about them, not hear them speak, but they can be giving off, and again, I'm not a new agey person, I don't go in for this mystical kind of, speak, but they give off a vibration or an energy, I don't know what else to call it, that can make me feel intensely ill, and I have to move away from that person. And similarly, also often in crowded places, I can feel depleted or completely drained of my energy, as if people are subconsciously feeding off my energy. But do human beings have an energetic field? I mean, I think science has proved we do have something, but is that what's happening with me? Because a place, an environment, a person or people can drastically affect how I feel in myself. And of course, everyone's like this to a degree. But sometimes the symptoms I experience as a result of just an apparently innocuous encounter or exchange or situation can be debilitating. So I am very interested in the impalpable, in what may be going on in terms of energetic exchange between human beings without our conscious knowledge or without our understanding entirely what's happening, merely because I've experienced it so strongly, so often, much more since I got older actually. I was always sensitive as a child, very sensitive, but I didn't used to feel ill when I was younger. But since being ill with ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, I just can't handle certain situations, certain people, and without wishing to denigrate anyone or any situation, I just simply find some things toxic. That's how it feels to me. And when I remove myself again, I'm okay. And I can recharge. Now, as an introvert, it's quite common. I mean, introverts can only really recharge their batteries, so to speak, on their own. So I understand all of that. But what I don't understand is why seemingly pleasant people, seemingly ordinary environments can have such an effect on me. And I believe this is very much tied in with why I got ill in the first place and how I got better. But I don't quite understand that side of it as much as the emotional side of it. So I think this video will only resonate with people who have experienced something similar, because what I'm talking about is not really very commonly accepted yet, and so it'll just have to chime with whoever it chimes with. Thank you so much for watching.